In the past couple of lessons, we've been looking at the work of the church. The work of the church is nature. It is spiritual, dealing with the eternal salvation of man. And that's the work of the church, to save mankind. That work is accomplished in first preaching to the lost, and we studied that, then edifying or building up the saved, and we discussed that, but then there's the area of benevolence, and that's what we're going to discuss in this class period. Benevolence certainly is a work of the church. In Galatians 6, 9, and 10, Paul would write, "Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we therefore have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith." And so here is doing good to all men. And that would include, in particular, the household of faith, or those who are Christians. But the aspect of doing good, and I think it's a good possibility. I would not unequivocally this, but the Corinthian letter, actually the Galatian letter, was written in light of that collection that Paul was taking up to take to Jerusalem. And thus, the doing good unto all men, especially them who are the household of faith, might very well have reference specifically to that aspect of, or the good in particular, to that contribution that he was taking up. And so do good in relationship to the contribution or giving in this benevolent work. And that would be to all men, especially those who are of the household of faith. Now, let me mention one aspect here. A lot of times we run across those who hold the saints-only view in relationship to benevolence. That is, that the church can only help those who are members of the church. We cannot help those who are not members of the church. And when you appeal to Galatians 6, and specifically verse 10, they would say that that is individual action, not action for the church. If you look at the pronouns, though, as we have opportunity, let us do good. And so these are plural pronouns. They're not singular. It's not as the individual has opportunity. It's not as I have opportunity, or as you, singular, have opportunity. It's let us, and that's a collective, a plural, us, or we. And then let us, plural, do good. I'll put it this way, it is difficult to find those who hold the saints-only position who will be consistent in relationship to the saints-only. There's a lot of questions that can be asked of them. For example, if one individual in a family is a Christian, then can you help them? And if you do, are you helping non-Christians? Well, yes, if the rest of the family members are not Christians, you'd be helping non-Christians out of the treasury. But then they would say that, yes, you could help them, that family, because they're, one individual is a Christian. What if the breadwinner is the Christian, but the rest of the family members are not? Could that family be helped? And so there's a lot of questions likened to that you will not find a consistency in relationship to that saints-only position.
What's the Michael? What's the impetus for that particular position anyway? Since it doesn't really have a scriptural basis. So what is the driving force behind it?
Uh,
I mean, the word especially is in there. The word especially is in there in the Greek, so you already have it there as establishing more so to those who are Christians. But what is really behind this?
in asking what's really behind it, I just simply don't know. Uh, um, they think that they've seen something, and a lot of times it's with the anti-positions. And that's not just about saints only, but it's also dealing with other positions of the antis. It is, they believe you have to have an example in relationship to what is being commanded, and you must follow that example. When you look at, and we'll look at some of these passages, but in the benevolent work, you see the church helping those who are members of the church. And that's the example that we have. We don't really have an example of the church helping non-Christians. And because we don't have an example of that, then they say it's wrong for the church to do so. I think these passages, for example, Galatians 6, 9, or 10, do good unto all men. The ways in which they try and get around all men there really it becomes almost ludicrous. They have it basically saying, let us do good unto all Christians, especially those who are Christians. And because that's the position that they will hold on it, that all does not mean all there, that it is a limit all to those who are Christians. But if that's the case, then the latter part of the sentence, especially unto them who are of the household of faith, becomes nonsensical. If the
but just going back to that example that you were positing earlier, when they were making the collection for the saints, etc., that whole enterprise of Paul was involved in, and with the example that you gave, that would only be justified if every single member of that family were members of the church. If there was a head of a household who was a member of the church out of work or whatever, and they were trying to help him, well, and obviously that's going to filter down to every other member of the family. If his wife is not a Christian, if his older son is not a Christian but living there, and they're providing them with food, I mean, it's common sense.
Well, that's why I say they will not be consistent when you start asking these questions. And there's a lot of others, just like in our situation today. And I saw this one asked of someone: if a non-Christian comes into the assembly on Sunday morning and $1 bill, let's say, in the collection plate, and then goes out and he gets run over by, or gets hit by a car, can you then take any money out of the collection to call on a phone for help for that individual? Now, and
you're not serious.
Well,
wait a minute. Oh, from the collection.
Yeah, from the collection.
What?
Now,
well, everybody could do that. Well, first of all, you couldn't call on the phone because you're the paid preacher, so you definitely couldn't call. Now, somebody else could call on their cell phone, but because your salary, etc., compensation is paid through the collection, you can't make that call. I'm just telling you right now.
Let's take it before cell phones, though. You have a telephone that is paid for out of the church treasury, to make telephone calls. Now then, can the church then pick up that phone and make a telephone call to the emergency people to come and help this individual who is non-Christian? But to be consistent with their doctrine, they would have to say no. Because
yeah, to be consistent with their doctrine.
If you make a telephone call to the emergency crew to come and help that individual, that is using church funds for a non-Christian.
Well, that person wouldn't even have had to have come in at all, just anyone.
Well, it would just, building up the, you've got someone who has come in who is donating into the collection, and they will accept that. But then you can't take the money that even they have donated and use it to help them.
Well, maybe if it hadn't been counted yet.
But that's what I mean.
It's not officially. Maybe if it's not officially deposited in the bank or something. I don't know.
Deposited, but but the point is, you can ask these questions, and the brethren who hold this saints-only position will not be consistent all the way through. They will change up in order to accommodate certain aspects like unto that. And that's the point that I was trying to make. Again, there's a lot of those type of questions.
Michael.
Ask. Yes.
Michael, I understand that the anti's position is basically that they hold this position and they would draw lines of fellowship with any congregations or individual Christians who refuse to toe the line, as you would say. What if someone comes along and gives you this, who subscribe to this view, but he states it as a matter of it's only a matter of expediency for him. He doesn't see it as a line of fellowship. He's prepared to fellowship with you, but he holds this view.
I've come across a number of them who, more recently in the years, I have at least, who probably hold it that way. They're much more along that line. I don't know. What about you, Michael? Hi, Don.
I think that's accurate. I think those who hold these matters as a test of fellowship have dwindled, and a lot of them hold it as their personal view, not divide the church over it. I don't have a difficulty with that. Someone made the comment, and I think it's correct, that you can live below your privilege, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's when you bind that upon others that you have the problem. So if somebody wants to live below the privilege that they have in not giving benevolence to other individuals who are not Christians, they can do that. However, they cannot and do not have the right to bind it upon anyone else. And that's where the problem resides.
Yeah, Michael, that's very interesting because in the I think it was in the mid-90s in Singapore, my home congregation, Brother Fred Stancliffe was there. There were two American brethren who came, who joined themselves to the congregation. They subscribed to this view, the saints-only view. But my understanding was that their view was basically that to them it was not a test of fellowship. That's why they joined themselves to that congregation. And the mere fact is that they mentioned that itself. Some in that congregation seems to suggest that they are binding it upon us. So in the sense using a kind of censorship, that you're not even allowed to say anything out of that. If you say the mere fact you say it is that you are binding on us, and that as a result of that congregation split.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I remember a little bit about that from Fred talking to me about it, and there's the difficulty of knowing how these brethren have worked through the years,
Mm.
because they never come into an area and begin congregations. They come into areas and they try to steal a congregation. And they come in, as Peter puts it in 2 Peter 2, privily, to literally, it's by the side door. Instead of coming in openly, they come in sneaking with their doctrine to draw away disciples. And so there has to be in that a very cautious dealing with those individuals.
I do agree. I do agree with you, Michael. You see that the issue was basically I was well aware of what happened because although I was here in the UK, I was kept informed about it. And
Mm-hmm.
the two American brethren, when they realized that they were a bit of an opposition to their views, they even highlighted it to the minister that, do you think we should go? If we cause problems, tell us, we will go. You see, and the minister says, no, that's fine. So they stayed on, and then they got stabbed in the back in that sense. I thought it was a bit unfair.
It's again, it's a difficult position to be in, because where to go from, okay, we're mentioning it, to starting to teach it to others in private and trying to gain a following after them. That's where the problem resides many times.
Yes.
Now,
but the problem is because that they told the ministers that if you think that my view is causing unrest in the congregation, for peace sake, we are happy to leave the congregation and go somewhere else. You see,
yeah.
So just tell us, if you want us to go, we go. But they were told to stay. And then the assassination took place. I thought that was a bit underhanded.
It was assassination.
It might have been, but you have to also consider the way in which they worked through the years. And what are they going to do when that doctrine is preached against? If it is taught in the pulpit and in Bible classes in opposition to what they believe, are they going to cause problems at that point in time, or what are they going to do?
What I understood, what I understand from the situation was basically that they were happy for the opposite view to be taught over the pulpit. Garland Elkins was there, and Garland was actually invited to interview one of the brethren there. I have seen the interview records itself, which transpired to be totally inaccurate. Whoever was secretary then. But what I understood from them was that they said to Garland Elkins that, well, I mean that this is only our personal opinion. That if the congregation wants to give, fine. We don't have issues. We're not going to condemn them to hell, as the hardliners would do.
Yeah.
And, that itself, they were being mocked, and they caused a lot of problems. And as a result of that, a group of brethren who was very close to me, they left the congregation, not because of the anti-issues, not because of the views itself, but over the way that they were being handled. And that, until now, that it has never been resolved, because some of the brethren who left, who remained behind, they held the view that if you have such a view, even if it's a matter of opinion, the fact is that you air it out publicly, you need to repent. You're not even allowed to hold that view as an opinion. And that's where I disagree with that. I think, like you say, that if it's a matter of opinion, fine.
It becomes difficult in relationship to when is that privately held view becoming a false teaching. If they're out and teaching it as opposed to just holding it, then that's a different matter. And not being there, it's almost impossible to say, but I just know from the way in which the antis have worked through the year, the way in which they go about doing things, and will then gain a following. Now, were they mistreated in that situation? Well, possibly so, but it might be as a result of the history of and knowing their history. And it also might be that in airing it out and telling people this is the view that we hold, they were actually, some brethren felt like they were promoting the view. And thus, when does that just informing brethren that you hold the view become promoting the view? And that has to be considered, at least in relationship to dealing with these brethren.
Because the issue was basically that, like you say, that you promote a view, but does that constitute binding that view upon the church? Because my view is basically, it's not, unless you draw lines of fellowship, this is where you're buying, isn't it?
Well, there again, though, if they are teaching a doctrine, and this is what I'm saying with promoting, they're beginning to teach that doctrine, and that doctrine is false, then they are to be marked and withdrawn from. Romans 16, 17, and 18.
That is true. That's only if they hold it as the doctrine. But as I said earlier, that if they held it as a matter of personal conscience, but they have no objection to the congregation doing whatever they are doing, then it cannot be a matter of doctrine, isn't it?
But that's what I'm saying, though. We don't object, but then we're going to teach it otherwise.
But the teaching,
then
the leadership to decide, isn't it?
Well, again, you can teach something privately just as well. In fact, sometimes more effectively than you can publicly. And so all of those things would have to be considered in dealing with a situation like into that. Are they actually going to the point of promoting the doctrine, even though they're saying they do not hold it as test of fellowship? Even if they are promoting it, then Romans 16, verse 17 and 18 come into play as to their teaching that doctrine. Not just the aspect of that, they are holding it as a private view. So, and trying to stay away from that personal situation and deal with all this might happen. Those things have the way in which they have worked through the years. Whether it is really a situation where they are simply, they as an individual holding that view and holding it personally, whether they are advocating it, even though they're saying initially they're not holding it as a matter of fellowship. Because I've seen people who say that they don't hold it as a matter of fellowship and then in reality end up holding it as a matter of fellowship.
Yes, I think that if they show themselves up, then I think they need to be marked and withdrawn from, isn't it? But if they have not shown themselves to be that way, I think that is a bit, in the sense of reading into the mindset, isn't it? Rather than letting the evidence speak for themselves. You have a presumption of the innocence of the person until he's proven guilty. So yeah, I think that it's right for the church leadership or the eldership to exercise caution if they know that there are such brethren in their midst. But then I think that it's on the other hand, I think it's pretty wrong for them to be presumptuous in the sense that, oh, they come from such background, therefore they must be like that, and therefore we just mark them, even though they do not declare as a matter of doctrine, but as a matter of conscience.
Well, basically agree with that, but from the standpoint of where does their holding that view go to the point where they are advocating that view and advocating it to others. That has to be considered. And, for example, we have someone who is a member of our congregation. The elders know it, but I think most everyone knows it, that he has some anti-views. And a member of this congregation, I've heard him make a couple of comments that, I know where he's coming from because that's what his view is. Well, okay, but he hasn't really been advocating it, and he's not going around trying to get a following by talking to brethren to push this view. And so he remains in fellowship, and there's not a problem. But we also have to keep an eye out as to, okay, does he in some point in time start trying to push this doctrine a little bit more? And it's very interesting. And I can preach very hard and talk a great deal about liberalism in a sermon. And if I just barely mention antiism, I'll hear a comment from him. So that's just, I can just expect that because I know where he's coming from. And I'm not trying to be offensive in relationship to what I'm saying about them or him. I'm just saying you have to be careful in relationship to that, because that is historically the way in which congregations have been overtaken to the anti-position.
Yeah.
And sometimes we can become overzealous in doing that and watching for that, so that we sometimes, may go overboard in trying to make sure that error does not take over.
Yeah, the sad thing is basically that with that congregation in Singapore, basically that the split was not as a result of antheism. The split was because there was a group of brethren who disagree with underhanded tactics, being applied to those two brethren who subsequently left the congregation, but they did not join the other group as well. So so they left. And I think it was pretty sad that instead of the doctrine destroying the congregation, it was basically that his attitude. That I remember I went back, I made a special trip home. I sat one with both the groups, and when the attitude was awful. You tell them to come to repent. We're not going there. It's very sad. Yeah, it's very sad.
Yeah. It is. Any time you deal with those type of situations, it is very sad. And really, we ought to be generous and kind toward others in our dealings with them, but sometimes our emotions get involved, and we're not.
Yeah, they were not very benevolent, I would say.
But when you deal with the saints-only position, this passage, they say, will be individual action and not congregational action, is the way in which they will approach it. But the plural pronouns, to me, indicate that it would be as much congregational action as it would individual action. So you have that aspect, that we're to do good unto all of the household of faith. Another passage that Ephesians 4:28, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. And so here is a giving to those who are in need, and thus a benevolent activity. While this is specifically referring to the individual in Ephesians 4:28, yet the principle would still be the same in relationship to the church as a whole, that it is to be in that regards benevolent. We do see the church being benevolent. In Acts, the 2nd chapter, after the obedience to the gospel and 3,000 souls are added to the church, in verse 44 and 45, it says that all that believed were together and had all things common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men, as every man had need. One of the questions that could be asked is when it says, and parted them to all The men there, of course, is not in the original, but has been supplied. So just say imparted them to all, as every man had need. Is that all an unlimited standpoint, or is it limited in its scope to only those that were believers? It would be hard to say that one way or the other. Those who would hold the saints only would have to say that it's limited, again, to only the believers, though. But here, the church, they were together, had things common. Some individuals, of course, will talk about communism in this, and that's not what this is. Far cry from what communism is. This was voluntary, as we see later on with Barnabas and with Ananias and Sapphira.
Are you serious, Michael? Communism?
Oh, yeah. You haven't heard that? That it is communism in its purest form, they would say, would be everything and everyone works for that common good, and all of the goods go to that common treasury, and then it is given out equally among everyone. Pure form of communism, according to them, and then we'll appeal to this as a basis for that. I've heard that one before, but but yeah, there are.
No, I haven't heard that one.
You don't run it across it very often, but there are, every once in a while somebody will come up with that. But obviously here is benevolent work, as every man have need. There is a need there, and that's the idea of benevolence, is that meeting of that need. Later on, Acts the 4th chapter, verse 34 and verse 35. Neither was there any among them that lacked. For as many as were possessors of houses or lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made to every man according as he has need. So again, there's the same aspect that is seen. Those individuals who had lands and houses, selling them, bringing the things that were sold, and then distribution being made to those who were in need. And we might add, as you go into chapter, you immediately see that this was not something that was forced or required of them. Is and Peter tells Ananias, while it remained, was it not thine own? After it was sold, was it not in thine own power? In other words, he did not have to sell it. Even after he sold it, the money that he had gained from selling it, he could do with what he wanted to. It was not a forced thing as far as they're giving it. But you do see the aspect that there is a collection that is taken up, that which was sold, the money being brought, distribution then being made unto those who have need. That's benevolent work. You see it again in chapter 6 in relationship to the Grecian widows. The first 3 verses in particular, but verse 1, there's a murmur of the Hebrews because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Well, the daily ministration there would be that daily giving of those things that were of need. And so these widows, Grecian widows, were being neglected, and thus the Grecians were murmuring against the Hebrews. And as you go on in that context, you see then the aspect of the those men who were selected, 7 men, to work over this. Some call them deacons. Whether they were or not, they certainly were doing the work that deacons do. I don't think they were officially deacons myself, but it doesn't really matter one way or the other. But those 7 men took the benevolent work. In Acts 11th chapter, verses 27 through 30. In those days came the prophets from Jerusalem and Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great dearth throughout all the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. By the way, that's the first time in which elders or the church are being discussed. We might mention in regards to this, and don't want to go into great depth, but there are those who take an anti-cooperation viewpoint, that one church cannot send funds to another church and for a work that other church is doing. Here, while it is from a benevolent aspect, have the brethren where Antioch, the brethren at Antioch, sending money to the elders at Jerusalem. It was done by the hands of Barnabas and Saul, but it was sent to the elders at Jerusalem. Thus, you have one congregation sending money to another congregation, in this case for benevolent work. Those who hold the saints-only position emphasize the sending of relief unto the brethren that dwelt in Judea, and try to bind that as something that is binding. It can only be done to the brethren. That's one of the passages that they would use to illustrate that. And again, we've dealt with that aspect, but here, money being sent from one congregation to another congregation, and the elders of that congregation for a specific work, here the work of benevolence. But the very fact that it is for benevolence shows that benevolence is a work of the church. We are to be benevolent people. In relationship to spiritual matters, and kind of as an aside, you might study Philippians, the 4th chapter. I believe it's around verse 15 and 16 thereabouts. You have the church at Philippi taking money in and then doling that money out to Paul in relationship to the preaching of the gospel. And he uses actually banking terms of the day, giving and receiving. They took money in and then they distributed that money. There you have that type of a situation in relationship to spiritual work in regards to the preaching of the gospel. Here in Acts 11th chapter, you have it in relationship to benevolent work. One congregation sending money to another congregation. One other passage, Acts the 20th chapter, verse 35, where Paul is talking to the Ephesian elders. I have showed you all things, how that so laboring ye ought to support the weak, and to remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. So there again, Paul, in talking to the elders at the church at Ephesus, tells them the aspect and reminds them of the words of Jesus in relationship to benevolent work, that we are to be a. And so that's certainly a work of the church. And I say that in relationship to realizing that the work of the church is saving souls. That work is accomplished through those 3 avenues of preaching, edifying the saved, and then that area of benevolence. And we might mention in closing on this that when we're talking about benevolence, we are talking about and dealing with those people who have true needs. And it is the meeting of those needs, and that's what benevolent work is actually all about. It is meeting that need that an individual has, a physical need that will then be taken care of, and through that then we have an avenue of teaching them the truth or teaching them the gospel. It's not necessarily giving people what they want. Through the years, and I imagine Johnny has faced this, and maybe all as well, we've had all sorts and all kinds of the guise of benevolence. We had an individual who came here one time who wanted us to buy them a motorhome. And I'm serious about that. That is what he wanted. And of course, our elders at the time said no. And he raked them over the coals for not loving people and doing what the church is supposed to do. It's always interesting to me that these individuals who know absolutely nothing about the church and about the Bible are going to tell us and give us instruction as to here's what the work of the church is really all about, and you don't understand it. But that's what he did, and said he'd never set foot in this building again until he did, because he came back again and wanted it. So it's not meeting the simply, I want this, so the church needs to supply it for me. It is meeting actual physical needs that an individual has, those immediate needs, so that we have that opportunity to teach them the gospel. That's the spiritual aspect of benevolence. And I think many times it's forgotten.
I thought the eldership offered him the mansion instead.
Offered him what?
John 14, you know. Offer him a mansion and quote John 14 to it.
Oh, I'm surprised they didn't do that, but they didn't.
What a shame.
I guess they were too mean. So I've had people call me and want us to buy air conditioners for them. And my first thought was, some of our own members don't even have air conditioning, and you want us to buy an air conditioner for you? You know, no, thank you. But you know, buying an air conditioner, providing somebody with a motor home, those are not needs that an individual has, and I'm talking about immediate needs.
Yeah, you often hear people you often hear people who come by and they need, or they say they need gasoline money or money from medicine or everything, but rent. You know, it's the whole. You know, it's the whole. Yeah, they'll be out on the street. They can't. You know, it's just you hear it all, and you hear it all the time.
You really do, and sadly, a lot of these people who come around in the United States have become professional bums. And
they prey on any religious organization.
They do. There's the story that a brother told me of where he preached one time. It was a small congregation outside of a larger town. And as he finished his sermon that Sunday night, he comes out into the foyer, and there on the sitting on the floor was a man holding a little baby, and he wanted money, and they helped him, gave him quite a bit of money for a small congregation. The next day, as he's driving into that larger town, he looks up as he passes a motorhome that's pulling a boat, and there's that man who was sitting out there. The guy was a professional bum who went to church after church getting money, and he knew exactly how to do it. Well, if a man doesn't work, Paul says, neither let him eat. There's that principle. We don't have to, simply because somebody wants something, we don't have to provide it for them. It's not the church's responsibility. It's still, yes, you meet physical needs of an individual for the purpose of teaching them the gospel, that we will have that opportunity. That's what true benevolence is all about, not simply meeting physical needs. As Jesus went through, and I think this is a good illustration, we'll probably need to end with this, but as Jesus went through healing people, healing diseases and such, it was not simply to alleviate the problems of that individual. It did accomplish such, but that was not the basic. The basic purpose behind it was to produce in those individuals belief. When it says that he went into his own and his own people, his own city, or his own area where he grew up, and he could not do many miracles there because the people were offended, it's not Christ's inability to do the miracles. It was the realization that the miracles were not producing faith in those individuals, and thus he could not do. Instead of producing faith in them, it went the other way in reality, and so he did not do many. Well, that's the same principle. We are benevolent, so we have that opportunity of those individuals. It's not simply to provide for bums who want to come around all the time and say, you need to give me money. You need to provide this for me or that for me. It is, though, the meeting of that need of an individual for the purpose of the salvation of their soul. So we'll need to stop with that, and we'll pick up with some other things maybe next week, Lord willing, in relationship to the identity of the church as we're talking about in different aspects. So let me end it, the broadcast, and we'll